Here is Chris Christie making it very clear he didn't know about it. Roll it.
And I'll say one last thing, just so we're really clear. I had no knowledge or involvement in this issue, in its planning or its execution, and I am stunned by the abject stupidity that was shown here, regardless of what the facts ultimately uncover. This was handled in a callous and indifferent way, and it is not the way this administration has conducted itself over the last 4 years, and not the way it will conduct itself over the next 4. I will do everything within my power to assure the people of New Jersey that, and I thank them for their willingness to consider my apology on behalf of this government. In the end, I have 65,000 people working for me every day, and I cannot know what each one of them is doing at every minute. But that doesn't matter. I'm ultimately responsible for what they do. And that's why I took this action.
Yeah, throw on the 65,000. Thomas Wisniewski, who is investigating this, he's an assemblyman in New Jersey, out of Middlesex, New Jersey. And he had this to say to CBS News about the governor's story about people in his administration who knew and were engaging in this behavior, and questions, because of the context, Chris Christie's denial of knowing. Roll it.
Well, we have to put it all in the context. The governor said he knew nothing until the morning of January 8th. But when this started, it started by a person very close to him. Bridget Kelly, his deputy chief of staff, sent an email to close those lanes. High appointees implemented. David Wildstein. When the lane caper became known to the executive director, Pat Foy, he shut it down on September 13. Starting then, all of his members of his senior staff, Michael Druniak, Regina Agia, Charlie McKenna, and others knew that there was something going on because they got copies of that email. They got copies of that communication. It's hard to believe in the middle of a gubernatorial election that the governor didn't have a conversation with somebody on his senior staff about a big problem in Fort Lee. Bridget Kelly, who got the email, was in the chain of emails from Pat Foy saying, I'm going to reopen the lanes, was with the governor on that day when he went down to the Seaside fire scene. And so she spent the day with him and never talked about it.
Joining us now is our good friend Hans von Spakovsky. He is the senior legal analyst at the Heritage Foundation. He is also their director for election reform, their center on election reform. Welcome back, Hans. How are you?
Crane, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Okay, so legally, cut through this for us, because we're obviously, there are politicians now, there are people in New Jersey saying, hey, he punished me with about Sandy funds. That would be, I guess, a federal investigation, federal dollars. But with Chris Christie and the comments made by the state investigator, the state assemblyman, that he doesn't buy the story, as you're digesting this as a legal analyst, what are you focusing in on?
Well, I'm focusing in on, I don't quite understand why it is that the U.S. attorney in New Jersey immediately announced the opening up of a federal investigation. I have no idea what in the world he is talking about in terms of any kind of federal law being violated because some lanes were closed on a highway. And contrast that with the fact that the FBI and the Justice Department supposedly have been investigating the targeting of the IRS for, since last June? And so far, nothing has happened other than that they refuse to give Congress any information to updating the status of the investigation.
It's 44-2 or 88-2 on the stories in the press. That would be Christie, Bridgegate versus the IRS scandal in the last 6 months, respectively. So, Hans, you're seeing that. So what you're saying is, this is a state matter, and now we have the introduction, I guess, of Sandy funds. But that story was alleged by, if I'm not mistaken, Rand Paul a while back. So wouldn't there have been an investigation into that already?
Well, we don't know because that would be up to the Justice Department, the FBI, to decide whether there's any valid information there that requires the opening up of an investigation. And I'm not aware that there's been any kind of announcement or anything about whether that's happening.
Just to hit Christie from a general stance, I mean, we're in the laity, you're the expert, you know, you have a better sense of when people either are massaging the truth or not telling it. My question to you is, do you believe Christie?
I don't know enough about the situation to surmise one way or the other. Look, there's no doubt that what happened was, frankly, stupid and petty, but whether or not it mounts to violating any kind of law, I think is an entirely different issue. And whether he knew or didn't know about it, I really don't know, because I don't know what the relations are between him and his staff and how well they keep him apprised of stuff.
It will be very interesting to see, again, if you're looking to contrast only to highlight what's going on in the IRS investigation, about the meetings that took place between senior level officials and the IRS at the White House, the minutes of those meetings, when Obama knew, what did he know, when did he know it, what did he say, and the decisions on when the behavior began. Because there is, in the IRS scandal, there are some dots there that are not too difficult to connect, aren't there?
Well, there are, but we don't know if we're ever going to find that out or whether there's really going to be a serious investigation, because, you know, that we discovered last week that the Justice Department put a lawyer from the Civil Rights Division, which is the most politicized division of Justice, in charge of this, and she is a big-time Democratic and Obama donor. I mean, she's a career lawyer, yet she's given over almost $7,000 to the president and the Democratic Party.
My knee-jerk reaction to that is a Republican never would have gotten away with this. Never. And I'm not about R's or D's. That's not my concern. It just, as you highlighted from the beginning, look at the coverage, look at the behavior, either of the press or the agencies that are designed and put in place to make sure the powerful don't abuse their power. It's
well, you're
stark.
absolutely. Look, you're absolutely right about this, Crane. You and I both know that it would be a front-page story at the New York Times and accompanied by a critical editorial if a Republican was being investigated and the chief lawyer put in charge of it was a big Republican donor to that Republican politician.
Absolutely. I'm going to play for you a piece of what Eric Holder said last week regarding Utah and the recognition of homosexual marriage by the government, by the Justice Department. Roll it.
Last June, the Supreme Court issued a landmark decision in United States versus Windsor, holding that Americans in same-sex marriages are entitled to equal protection and equal treatment under the law. This ruling marked a historic step towards equality for all American families. And since the day it was handed down, the Department of Justice has been working tirelessly to implement it in both letter and in spirit, moving to extend federal benefits to married same-sex couples as swiftly and smoothly as possible. Recently, an administrative step by the court has cast doubt on same-sex marriages that have been performed in the state of Utah. And the governor has announced that the state will not recognize these marriages pending additional court action. In the meantime, I am confirming today that for purposes of federal law, these marriages will be recognized as lawful and considered eligible for all relevant federal benefits on the same terms as other same-sex marriages. These families should not be asked to endure uncertainty regarding their status.
We got it. Thank you. Hans, your response to the Attorney General's move.
Well, look, you and I talk a lot about the lawlessness of this administration, but even I'm astounded at Holder's lawlessness here. Look, that Supreme Court decision he was talking about, Windsor, all the Supreme Court said in that case was that if a state, a particular state, recognizes same-sex marriages, the federal government has to recognize the same-sex marriages in those states. But as the Attorney General admitted, Utah doesn't recognize same-sex marriages. The court opinion that said they were going to have to has been stayed by the U.S. Supreme Court. So how in the world does he think he has the power to recognize same-sex marriages for federal purposes in Utah when the state doesn't recognize them? I mean, that's completely at odds with that Supreme Court decision that he's citing.
So what's the recourse for Utah now with the Attorney General?
Well, they just the only real recourse they've got is to continue fighting this litigation. They don't really have a say in the federal issue and the federal benefits that the government is now going to recognize. I mean, the American taxpayer does, but the Utah government, they've just got to keep fighting this case in the appeals court and try to get the district court's opinion overturned.
And is this something that Congress can address, and has it? In the sense of this action by Holder, is there a response to the attempt to either have hearings on this behavior of the Justice Department, of the overstep?
Well, they could, but will they have the political courage and willpower to do it, Crane? I have my doubts about that.
Don't we all? Hey, recess appointments. The NLRB, President Obama appointed, made a recess appointment when Congress wasn't in recess to the National Labor Relations Board. What's the status of this? Because it went before the Supreme Court today, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, the government was in court today arguing that the lower courts, which basically said that what the president did was unconstitutional, were wrong. I was actually there. I heard the arguments. The government had a very tough time. Even the liberal justices, who are normally on the side of the Obama administration, were asking some very tough and hard questions, and they gave the government a much harder time than they gave the company, Noel Canning, that has filed this suit. It's not good to predict the Supreme Court, but I tell you, I think the government is going to lose this case. I think even some of the liberal justices will vote against them, and it's only a question of how far will the court go.
What's that like? When a case is being argued, take us into the room.
Well, they had 90 minutes of argument. The government got 45 minutes. And what happens is the lawyers get up there who are arguing the case, and I can tell you they're constantly interrupted by the justices asking them questions. Justice Scalia, for example, is usually pretty active. So is Justice Sotomayor. And they were asking a lot of hard questions and sometimes interrupting the lawyers, particularly the government lawyer, when they thought that the lawyer was not actually answering the question. And, sometimes they crack jokes. Justice Scalia did that today at the expense of the lawyers.
Well, we look forward to your prediction coming true. And the Supreme Court won't revive Arizona's law banning most abortions after 20 weeks. Any thoughts on this, Hans?
Well, that would seem to settle the matter from a legal standpoint. So, that kind of ends the judicial fight over it.
So the ban, the idea that Arizona's appeal on the abortion ban will not be heard, that's settling it right now.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Hans, I know you've written a great article regarding the election fraud in 2008. I need to talk to you about that a little later on this week, unfortunately, but with your permission, may I post that?
Yes, please. Please do.
Thank you very much. Hans, it was always a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you, Crane.